We're not up yet, are we, Scott?
Soon.
I'm here.
There you go.
All right. I see that we're live on Alpha News. That's excellent. All right. Hello again. Welcome back to another live stream. This is the first Tuesday conservative live stream hosted by Alpha News Minnesota. You may notice that it is not the first Tuesday of the month. That is because we have begun a new series called Countdown to November 3rd, where we're going to be hosting a variety of interesting characters relevant to the conservative conversation as we approach the 2020 elections. Joining us today is Horace Cooper. Horace Cooper is a senior fellow with the National Center for Public Policy Research and the co-chairman of Project 21 National Advisory Board. He's also a legal commentator and an author. Horace, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, great to be on the program.
So one thing that our viewers might recognize you from is your book, How Trump is Making Black America Great Again, the untold story of advancement in the era of Trump. I've also seen you on Fox News and other outlets talking about how the riots right now and sort of the narrative that the public's being sold around minority issues and Donald Trump is incorrect. Could you just tell us a little bit about your unique perspective on this issue?
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon that I'm observing, and that is there has been a commitment made on the part of elites and on the part of progressives that Black America is so unhappy, with the state of play in America, that what they would prefer is that the entire societal superstructure of America be turned over and replaced by something new. And there is almost no evidence that would demonstrate that that is true. Black Americans were critical, in fact, to the selection of Joe Biden as the nominee of the Democrats. And the reason that he was popular with Black America is not because, as some have simplistically said, well, he was Barack Obama's running mate. Actually, he initially had been positioned as the moderate. And Black Americans, when you ask them their views, regardless of how they politically identify as either Republicans or Democrats, are quite centrist. Black Americans believe in a higher percentage than the rest of the population that faith and religion ought to be central to the public square. Black Americans believe that law enforcement is an important and critical part of our society, and they're saying in surveys in higher numbers than any other group that they do not wish to defund the police. Black Americans actually believe in this idea of people working hard and being able to achieve. Black Americans in support of that, Black Americans created more small businesses per capita in the last 3 years than any other racial group. Now, these things aren't often discussed when elites, and particularly progressives, but sometimes that's redundant, when they talk about Black America. What Joe Biden has managed to do is, in the course of his effort to secure the nomination, he has been pushing away from the centrist mantle that he initially adopted. And it is the social justice warrior view that is extremely unpopular with Black America. Black America is not in favor of misgendering becoming a federal priority. Black America is not interested in the idea that the government ought to take over large swaths of the economy and provide, quote, a guaranteed income. So many of the initiatives put forward by progressives just turn out not to be true. Project 21, which I'm one of the co-chairmen of, put out a survey a couple years ago, and we asked Black Americans this simple question: how much more would you be willing to pay for a gallon of gasoline if you thought it could go toward saving the planet from overheating and reducing global warming? When we asked people blacks, if they would be willing to spend $1, we couldn't get 1% of black Americans to say it. When we asked if they'd be willing to spend 50 cents more a gallon, we couldn't get 20% to say it. You had to get down to a number under a nickel before you could actually find large numbers of blacks saying yes. And still, the largest number of blacks were saying zero was the exact amount they would be willing to pay extra in order to do this. Here's the point. This idea that black America is made up of radical progressives and the social justice warrior agenda just doesn't bear out. And that is what I'm witnessing, that there are folks who have so convinced themselves of the opposite that they are they are on the edge of the limb, and then they've jumped 4 or 5 steps, and they're staying on air while they're guaranteeing to themselves, to whoever will listen, that this is where black America is. And that, I think, is a deadly assumption to be made.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Despite the fact that, and I've heard this from multiple people, not just you, despite the fact that black America is significantly more centrist than the progressive Democrats currently represent themselves, it does seem like large swaths of the black population in America continue to vote Democrat. Why do you think this is?
Well, it's true that more black Americans identify themselves as Democrats than not. But part of that has been the residual effects of former President Lyndon Johnson's effort, which now historians tell us he was very cynical. But part of that was the effects of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and other measures designed to send a signal that black America was welcome within the broader American society. We now know, historians tell us, that LBJ was actually quite cynical and acted not because of what he thought was just, not because of what he thought was fair and appropriate, but certainly for the political calculation. Sure. Many of your listeners, and I mentioned this in my book, may not be aware of this, but we have the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, not because of anything the progressives did, but it was part of an Eisenhower Civil Rights Act that was filibustered, only allowing the Department of Justice to have authority to investigate civil rights violations, a right and authority that they continue to have today. However, had Democrats not filibustered this Eisenhower civil rights, about 90% of what America recognizes as the civil rights laws of today would have occurred. Notably, the civil rights law that Eisenhower put forward only covered government or public sector actions and very limited private sector actions. And there was a reason that in America at the time, there was a presumption that private actors ought not be covered by government coercion and government control. That was that distinction. But what it meant was your local county, your mayor, your state government, the federal government could never discriminate against people. If you look back at the Jim Crow laws that happened as part of the early 20th century, the overwhelming majority of them, the overwhelming nearly 99% of them were all about the use of public sector power to separate people. Very little of what we recognize as Jim Crow had anything to do with what private actors were doing. All of that is to say, there was always a commitment in America to the idea that people should be, regardless of race, throughout the 20th century, regularly this debate was being had. There was a strong and robust idea that black Americans, white Americans, brown Americans should be considered equal before the law. And today, black Americans continue to be under the impression that because it happened when Democrats were in power, that was primarily that. Now, the last thing, I know I've run a little long, the last part of your answer is, and there has been a 20-plus year-long campaign fomented by media elites, by progressives, by a higher education institution, and many prominent Democrats to argue that Republicans in and of themselves are in some way hostile to the interest of black America. Many of your listeners may or may not recall that in 2000, there was an ad ran that literally had the sounds of a black person being dragged behind a pickup truck with a voiceover of a family member saying that it's like my brother was being killed all over again. It is that attitude and those actions that have been very, very powerful in causing black America to assume one group was friendly and one group was hostile.
Yeah, I think you make a very important and under-recognized point. When it comes to getting this message out and disseminating it, how can our viewers and other political actors try to spread this word?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this book, because I would like people to see for themselves what it is that's been going on in America. There has been what I referred to the other night as an awareness for a day of reckoning. Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, and many black Americans were really, really excited about this. And he received a record number of votes from black Americans. But guess what? There were a number of white Americans who had not voted for a Democrat. They had not voted for a Democrat in 2004, had not voted for a Democrat in 2000, had not even voted for a Democrat when Bill Clinton was successfully reelected in 1996, who joined in support for Barack Obama's first election. And he has the 21st century high watermark for the largest number of votes of a president being successfully elected. But what people haven't pointed to was what happened when he was running for re-election. Our former president, Barack Obama, has the distinction of being the first president in 100 years who was re-elected and received fewer black votes than he did when he was running for election.
Interesting.
Just think about that. George W. Bush was successfully reelected. He received more black votes the second time. Ronald Reagan was successfully reelected. He received substantially more black votes the second time. Richard Nixon. You can go down the list of Republicans, but you can also go down the list of Democrats. It didn't matter if you were successfully reelected in the last 100 years for two-term presidents. I got to give that little caveat. You see this pattern. Barack Obama was the first president where that did not occur. And there's a reason that did not occur. The reason that didn't occur is that a growing number of Americans, particularly black, but a growing number of Americans, began to see that the policies that were being implemented didn't line up with what was actually happening, the actual record. More black Americans lost their homes during the 8 years of the Barack Obama administration than we saw in any earlier period for 60 plus years. More black Americans went on food stamps. More black Americans ended up having to separate, go get a divorce because of the financial pressures that happened on their relationships. More black young people ended up having to move back at home. More black Americans, if they had a house, it was foreclosed. If they had a car, they ended up losing it than we had seen in a generation. People realized, not just blacks, but people realized that these policies didn't actually work. The rhetoric was great, but the actual policies didn't work. And that was a precursor to what was going to happen in 2016. Large numbers of people who had voted for Barack Obama did not vote for Hillary Clinton and instead voted for Donald Trump. It's important for people to realize that Americans always use their own personal experiences as a basis for deciding how they're going to cast their vote. And we're being presented, and I want to make sure people understand this, we're being presented with a very, very stark choice: the social justice warrior agenda or the limited government agenda that, as I mentioned in my book, worked amazingly well for Warren G. Harding, worked very well for Calvin Coolidge, and worked extremely well for Black America during the Roaring '20s. We've forgotten that there was this period when black men were the most likely to be employed of any race group in America, and that was true throughout the 1920s. We've forgotten that black Americans were the least likely to be in federal prison in the 1920s, even in the 1930s. We've forgotten that black American children were more likely than any other group to be born in a two-parent, stable, married household. These realities are not presented to us. Instead, what we're presented with are data that is largely a phenomenon of the last 20 to 25 years and presented as if all that happened was one day slavery ended and then it was 1995. This is not true. There has been a steady gain in the number of black Americans who gained housing, in the number of black Americans who stayed married and were monogamous, and the number of black Americans per capita in the 1920s who became millionaires. Do you know that you have to go all the way up to the 1980s before you exceed that per capita rate? Thanks to the destructive policies of FDR and government coercion that devastated economic opportunities for all Americans, but were particularly devastating for black Americans.
You talk about how people's lived experiences impact their voting. You talk about these trends and these shifts and how people are forgetting how prosperous Black America used to be per capita relative to what we're seeing now. How do you think the recent divisions we're seeing in the wake of George Floyd's death and in the riots are going to factor into sort of the political consciousness of Black America moving forward?
So in my book, I step on some toes, as my grandmother would say. I raise some important points. One is that today, unlike 1920, unlike 1930, even unlike 1940, today a disproportionate amount of violent criminal behavior is carried out by young black men in the age range of 16 to 25, a disproportionate amount. Now, we've been presented with this argument that anytime you see a disproportionate race event, you should ascribe that to bigotry and discrimination. We have had a nationwide conversation about race and protesting and rioting and looting over this idea that a wild number of black unarmed men are being gunned down by law enforcement. Well, here's an interesting data point. Twice as many Americans were struck by lightning in 2020 and in 2019 than the number of unarmed black men shot by police officers. And yet, There has not been some nationwide outrage to discuss why is it that lightning is such a dangerous phenomenon, and what can we do to save ourselves? And maybe we need shutdowns, and maybe we need to limit our exposure. None of that is occurring because the number of lightning strikes is so minuscule. We don't look at that as a significant set of risks. Similarly, you are far more likely as a white male to be shot by law enforcement than black male. But the truth is the numbers are still very, very tiny. The problem we have is that we are presented with a context of things that are not accurate. Now, I started this conversation with the idea that essentially black youth are disproportionately, some 30 to 40% of violent crime that happens in America is being carried out by this group of people, overwhelmingly male. Black men as a group are only 6.2% of the population. Even if, and that's black men from 0 all the way to 90, even if that same group were the ones behind the lion's share of violent crime, that 6%, that 66% is 5 times more likely to commit violent crimes than it is represented in the population. But as I said, it's more likely 1%. 1% is doing the lion's share of the crime. That means if you're a judge, black, white, brown, when you sit and hear the cases just of the pleas, not of the jury trials, just of the pleas, what you see is a large number of black Americans coming in and admitting that they committed this heinous crime. Just if you were a victim's rights person, whether you work in the hospital, you're a social worker, or any other setting, and you deal with victims, what you're dealing with are a large number of people who are disproportionately seeing, wait a second, this poor woman, this poor child, this older woman, they were assaulted, they were raped, they were beat. They are testifying that the people that did that to them were of a particular small group. Now, the left would have us believe that a woman who's been raped, a woman who was battered, whose purse was snatched and knocked to the ground, a woman who suffered a home invasion, would lie to the police so as to protect whites from being tainted from the crime. No interest on the part of these victims to ever tell us what happened so we could help solve the problem. But we know that's not true. My point is that if you were sitting as a victims' rights advocate, you would see all of these disproportionate number of young black men who are being accused of these events. If you are in law enforcement, you are witnessing firsthand the large overrepresentation. 6.2% of black Americans are men. 6.2% of the population is black American men. Are you aware that 11.5% of the law enforcement in America is black men?
Interesting.
A disproportionate number of black men put their lives on the line in order to protect communities. The media doesn't tell us this. The media doesn't tell us that if Colin Kaepernick attacks law enforcement with the pig's socks, that he's offending people like my cousin who works for the HPD, or people like my brother who was a correctional officer until he retired on death row in Texas. It is remarkable how little context is provided. And by the way, that same 6.2% are overrepresented in our military. My father, who was a Vietnam era person who served, he was not drafted. He volunteered. We're supposed to believe that if you were a minority and you served, you didn't have a choice. There are plenty of people who happen to be black who have chosen the career of service to their communities as law enforcement or a career in the military, and they have served with real distinction, and those people are rarely being insulted by the conversation that we see. So that it should provide some context that there was a time in the 80s and the 90s when black American leaders and white American leaders all came together and said, hey, this epidemic of crime that is happening in our communities, it's terrible. We want you to do something about it. And government actually did. And when it did, it was welcomed. It was not rejected.
And why
a new narrative is being presented today.
Why do you think that we've seen this move away from enforcing the law? Because it seems like the left has sort of co-opted some sort of racial argument as they try to defund the police. First of all, is this something that you even see supported in the black community? And why do you think this is something they're trying to do?
Our good friends on the left have actually been opponents of law enforcement for quite some time. Mm-hmm. The problem is they haven't had a good venue from which to present. When I was a little kid, there were not cable networks as we know them now, and so you had to get your news on the mainstream over-the-air networks. And those over-the-air networks were somewhat left of the center, but not radically left of the center. Not really because they didn't advocate those views, but because they believed that if they shared radical views, that would marginalize them with the public. We now have a mainstream media that no longer is concerned about being marginalized. And so you can look at Nielsen ratings, and what you'll see is a shockingly shrinking level of viewership for news programs. There's been only one news network in the last 25 years that has shown an increase, and that happens to be Fox News, because even though it is not a right-wing network, it is so much closer to the zeitgeist of where America is that Americans are not offended by it. We now see the NBA, the National Basketball Association, ratings are lower than we have seen in a decade. Where are Americans going? They're not leaving the house to go to work. They're not actually going out to malls to shop. They're certainly not getting, in a lot of places, a chance to go out to dinner. So you would think more people at home, larger audiences to watch. The Major League Baseball, the NBA, and I predict we're going to see the same with the NFL. As they insult, as they reject the common sense zeitgeist of where America is, fewer people will find time to tune in. And that's the phenomenon that we see today. Large percentages of the voices don't have an audience, but they are the only sources. There aren't very many alternatives, and they tell themselves, well, you said it, so I can repeat it, and I repeated it, and so someone else is going to be able to say it. It still doesn't mean that's where America is, but it is very easy to get confused by all of that soul sourcing of information and think, wow, America really must be bigoted. Wow, America really must be racist. There must really be a problem with law enforcement in America. Here's the truth. It's not. It was never true. The left has always had this hostile interest. They now have voices where they can say it publicly, and many times we mistake the willingness for people to say crazy things in public for assuming that that must be mainstream.
That's a very good point. You got a small group of ultra progressives that control media, they control the public messaging, and sometimes people can get confused about what the majority of Americans actually believe when all the messaging is coming from such a radical group. Just a reminder to the viewers, on the line now we have Horace Cooper. He is a senior fellow with the National Center for Public Policy Research and co-chairman of the Project 21 National Advisory Board. Horace, I have one more question for you here. Where do you see Black America going in the 2020 election? Because I've seen some commentators being very optimistic about Black Americans going for Trump, wanting to restore more peace and lawful order to their cities and communities. And then I've also seen people like Biden basically taking the Black vote for granted. What's your perspective on this?
Well, my organization is taking no official position on the election. Sure. I can just tell you what it is that I see. The magic number that everyone should pay attention to is 85. Okay. We've had a conversation. It's what percentage of votes of Black voters are going to vote for Romney? What percentage of Black voters are going to vote for Donald Trump or whoever the candidate is? But the magic number is 85. If 85% of Black America votes for the Democrat, the progressive platform wins. If 85 does not, then there's no way for that platform to prevail. Now, in 2016, 88% of Black America voted for Hillary Clinton, and she still lost. We're now looking at that number dropping to 82, to 79, maybe even 75. What I will tell you is Black Americans do not embrace the social justice warrior position, and increasingly Black men, which by the way, in 2016, Black men were 60% of the vote who voted outside of that 88%, or simply speaking, voted for Donald Trump. Of the Blacks who voted for Donald Trump, more than 60% of them were Black men. We are seeing signs that Black men in particular are extremely unhappy that there is no special agenda forward that is going to do this. One, let them get a brand new pickup truck. Two, let them move out from mom and dad's or aunt and uncle's place. Three, let them live in a community where they can have their kids go to the schools that they want. Now, you don't need 50% of Black men to think that. But if 35% of Black men think that, that changes not only what happens in November in the Electoral College, it changes whether or not the progressive vision or the conservative vision controls the United States Senate. In fact, it puts into play suburban districts as the battleground, since now urban communities would no longer be able to provide the support that progressives need. Philadelphia stops being that important. New Orleans stops being that important. Detroit stops being that important. Los Angeles stops being that important. If you see that kind of change, and this is what the surveys are showing, if you see that kind of change, it means that Black men in particular are not receptive to the social justice warrior agenda. There are practical ideas that both parties used to bring to bear in the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s. Those are being rejected for just two choices. One is a socialist vision, and the other is a market-oriented vision. No hybrid, no modifications between the two. And I think if I were a conservative, as I am, I would be much more optimistic with what the American people ultimately will do when faced with that choice.
Absolutely, absolutely. I do like ending the show on a little moment of optimism. I really appreciate you coming on the stream today, Mr. Cooper. Your style of commentary is direct and very bold, and I think our audience enjoyed it. Thank you very much for being with us. This evening
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. This evening at 6:30, we're going to have another guest, Mr. Jeffrey Lord, an author, political strategist, and the associate political director for Ronald Reagan. He is now a Fox News contributor, but he used to be CNN's token conservative. Again, that will be at 6:30 tonight, our usual time segment, only on a Wednesday, and the guest will be Jeffrey Lord. Thank you for tuning in. Check out Alpha News on Facebook and alphanewsmn.com if you're interested in learning more about Mr. Cooper's work, his book, How Trump is Making Black America Great Again, The Untold Story of Black Advancement in the Era of Trump, is for sale on Amazon. And you can also see his work at the National Center for Public Policy Research. Again, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in, and we'll see you at 6:30 tonight.